So I kind of led into this in my previous statement. Our second deployment strategy is what's called dark launching. And dark launching is where you release a feature, and a critical component of dark launching is what we call feature flagging. So you release a feature and you take the functionality for that feature, the code behind that feature, and you put it behind a flag that allows you to control whether or not it is visible to a given user or segment of users. And it's really not a whole lot more complicated than just that. There's putting a Boolean if-then clause around code that you're deploying. Now, there are a lot of solutions for this. I have a graphic here from LaunchDarkly, which is a well-known commercial version, but there are open source libraries for feature flagging. And they all add degrees of completeness to it. So they give you better ways to group users together, and they optimize the ways that you can turn on and turn off the flags and make sure that those flags cost as little as possible to check and execute. But in general, they give you a way to deploy software and then gradually reveal new features in that software to your customer base. And you may do that in any number of ways. You may do it by features of a given customer set. So maybe you've grouped people by regions and you want to release it to one region or another, or maybe by device types. Or maybe you're going to do it at random because you're doing some sort of experimentation, and you're going to gradually add random people into increasing percentages. So maybe you start by rolling out to 1%, then 5%, then 10%, 20% as you go out. What this does for you in terms of shift right testing is it gives you a way to get software into production. And the dark in dark launching is that you don't see that new feature, that new software that's been deployed until the feature flag is flipped. So it gives you a way to get your software out into production and give your testers or your test automation a way to access it in the production environment before it has the opportunity to be exposed to any of your sort of general users. And it gives you the opportunity to then gradually bring on real production load, real production usage, and learn from that. So as you're scaling up your feature flag, maybe you notice something that a use case that hadn't been seen before, or a particular load phenomenon, or a particular behavior in your infrastructure that you hadn't seen before. Or you can stop or even roll back your dark launch, your feature flag, when you see that. And that's a very powerful capability. And I don't think it can be understated how useful that is, particularly in our modern, continuous delivery paradigm. I talked about the fact that, any feature flag implementation is going to try to make feature flagging as low cost in terms of checking and even in terms of implementation as it can. But ultimately, feature flags are a cost. You can imagine if your code base had if-then checks throughout it, how it eventually becomes more and more difficult to understand. So an important thing, I think, to keep in mind if your development team is deploying using feature flagging for all the power it gives you, you need to keep in mind that as your feature flags are being fully used, as you're running them up to 100 and you feel confident that things are all working, you need to be retiring those from your code base over time. And some of the implementations of feature flagging have different support for this. So you may have easier or harder time finding out where all the feature flags are, but ultimately you need to check with some period to make sure that you've got all of your feature flags taken out. There may be some that you keep in your system for a longer time. There may be some you keep in perpetuity if you believe that they are things you want to toggle on and off for the long term. But for the most part, you need to be taking those out maybe every 30 days, every 90 days as they fill up. Again, if you think about mobile versus just pure web deployment, there's some things that you want to keep in mind if you're using feature flagging. One of those is that you're going to need to synchronize your mobile front end and your back end. And you may do that implicitly because you have the same user context on the mobile and the back end, or you may need or want to do that explicitly. So maybe you let your mobile device pass feature flags back through to your back end to let it know what functionality it expects. And you're also going to need to support both your front end and your back end platforms. Now, sometimes these may be the same platform. Maybe you're Node on the back end and you're all JavaScript, obviously on the front end. Then you've got one, language sort of infrastructure to manage. But most places that's not the case, particularly with mobile development. You're probably, on iOS, more than likely you're doing Swift or Objective-C. On Android, you're doing Java or Kotlin. Maybe you've got something else, but those are the two likely ones. And on the back end, it's very unlikely you're doing Swift. Maybe you're doing PHP, maybe you're doing Java, maybe you're doing JavaScript. You need to make sure that those are both supported, because more than likely, although a lot of feature flagging gets done on the front end, you're almost certainly going to need some back-end support to keep in mind. So having talked about those two deployment strategies to support shift-right testing, I just do want to take a little bit of time to sort of compare and contrast them, because they both deal with releasing new features to subsets of users, and they both are about decoupling deployment, so putting software into production, from release, making it visible to users. So just, to go over it, but not to belabor it, dark launches are most often used for new application features, in contrast to Canary releases, which can certainly support new application features, but are most useful and really usually the only way you can support new infrastructure changes. Dark launches are typically looking at how does a user respond to this feature, and Canary releases are often looking at how does this affect the performance of the system, because they're often involving back-end or infrastructure features. The dark in dark launch comes from the fact that often users don't know that they're involved in this process. They just are going to see a new feature at some point. They don't know that they don't or they do at any given time. Canary releases, you may be more explicit about that. You may have people opt into a beta release that cycles them into the Canary environment. But sometimes it operates the same way a dark launch does too.